Welcome everyone. Welcome to another wonderful episode of Knowledge Unbound. You know the drill at this point, right? This podcast is not about me, it's about the guests. And all we do is try to create a platform, an environment, an opportunity to really hear the beautiful stories of people who are thinking transformatively about education, how they think about that, how those thoughts turn into action, and what those actions have for us in terms of lessons. We are graciously brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. We are funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. My producer, the senior, Mr. Sega Vamasai. Sega, what's up?
Have you got any more adjectives for me, Brian?
You want me to come? I can come up with something. Don't tempt me.
The floor is yours, brother.
Are you okay? I know we have like several months until you leave, but are you in like senioritis mode?
No, not really.
No, okay.
I could probably feel it coming a little bit though.
Well, we're glad to have you here. We'll be happy for you, but we'll be sad to see you leave. Today's guest is an author, is a former high school teacher, somebody who's been in the world of secondary education for quite some time. And I've been very fascinated with just the different ways in which she kind of thinks about it and how she's able to express that, both in terms of feedback that she offers people that she consults with, but also the way she writes and thinks about it in a very kind of humorous way. And without giving away the cake too much, I'll leave it there. And I really hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Her name is Roxanna Elden Volmar. She is the author of a book called See Me After Class and another book called Adequate Yearly Progress. Hope you enjoyed. Roxanna Elden Volmar, welcome to Knowledge Unbound.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Say thank you at the end, right? We'll see how this goes, and then I'll see if you want to thank me or not. No, it'll be fine. So I don't like to do the whole, and I know I've said this probably every single episode, right? I want people to introduce themselves, because to me, that's an opportunity for them to tell their own story. So why don't you tell our audience who you are, what your journey has been, what led to the books that you've written, and anything else you want to share?
Sure. Can I ask you one follow-up question before I
Absolutely.
do that intro, which is, I would love to know who you consider the prototype of the audience who might be listening to this, because I want to make sure that I share information that will be most interesting and relevant to them.
I'll answer your question, but I also don't want you to put yourself in a position where you feel you have to filter your message or shape your message for a particular audience. Because one of the things I've loved about the Knowledge Unbound audience, and I know this because people have shared this with us, is they come to this podcast hoping to be opened up, right? They come to this podcast hoping to be exposed to stories and ways of thinking about education and all forms of education that they hadn't thought of before they clicked play, right? So, you will talk about things that, a lot of people who listen to this podcast are in higher ed, but there are a lot of secondary and primary ed people. So I want this story to be driven by you and your experience, and maybe not your anticipation of who might want to hear what.
Sure.
So
Okay.
Go for it.
So educators looking for new ways to think about education.
We'll take it.
And all right. So I was a teacher, public school teacher for 11 years. During that time, my sister started teaching, and I found that I was using my experience, not pretty recent experience as a first-year teacher, to coach her through her first year of teaching.
So what were you teaching?
I started out teaching fourth grade English as a second language in Houston. And then for the majority of my career, I was a high school English teacher, which is interestingly what I always pictured being. Since I was in high school, I would sit in my high school English classes and just think, like, I can do this better.
Well,
which turned out not to be true.
I was going to drill in on that a little bit.
Which turned out not to be true.
Okay.
At least for many years, it took me a long time to even get to the basic level of what I thought I saw my teachers doing wrong. And I was so disappointed in the teacher that I saw myself being at the beginning. That I just felt like people talk about teaching having a steep learning curve. But that did not capture what I needed captured about my first year.
Let's go back to high school a second. And without trying to call out your high school English teacher here, but what is it that at, I don't know, 16, I guess, 15, that you experienced that you're like, this can't be, there had to be some better than this? What was the feeling that you had that then turned that into, look, when I get an opportunity, I would like to give this a shot?
That's an interesting question because I actually had some very good high school English teachers.
Okay.
Yeah, I had some very good high school English teachers, and I'm thinking maybe I'm making it sound like I was down.
Yeah, I know
the
you're not.
teachers that
Yeah, I didn't want to kind of trap you with that.
Yeah,
I was
think
more
I
focused
had-
on your
yeah.
feeling.
I think I mean, like anyone, I had a mix of teachers.
Right.
I mean, I certainly had terrible teachers. I certainly had wonderful teachers. And I had a lot of teachers that were in the very large bell curve area in the middle. And what I think I just had inside me as a high school student was I used to write it in a journal. And I would just imagine myself in front of a class of high school students. And so I would come up with these ideas. I was writing lesson plan ideas.
Really?
I was writing, philosophies of teaching, and now I'm sure I would be pretty embarrassed if I went back and read them because it's still the writing of a high school student. But I was always sitting in class as a future teacher and as a future teacher of teenagers. It so happened that I started my career as a fourth grade teacher and learned a lot, but certainly that was not where I hoped to end up. But there's so many little micro skills that go into teaching that you don't even realize are things that people have developed through trial and error.
Right.
That where you think your jumping off point is not where your jumping off point is as a new teacher.
Yeah. Well, and this is why when you ask me about who my audience is, I push back and say, look, no, I don't want us to do that because even though, yes, a lot of people who listen to this podcast are college professors, that point you just made about so much of this is trial and error. So much of this is, there are things about that learning curve that many things don't quite capture. This is true for, I would argue, almost any classroom, including ones that are intro bio and upper level physics or whatever.
A lot of the people I work with are also professors at the college level. I think there's certain skills that go all the way through from pre-K to being a professor. But
so in the years, you used a phrase that said, it took you many years to even get to a point where you felt you were struggling at the same level that your own teachers may have been struggling. Talk us through a little bit of what those years was like. Like, what were the lessons that came back to you? What did you felt like you weren't as good as you could be at? And perhaps, what were the things that put you in a position to reflect and realize, hey, I need to get past whatever it is I can't get past?
I think that what threw me off as a teacher learning to teach is that there's a lot of teacher advice out there. A lot of teacher advice out there. A lot of it is focused on how to elevate your teaching from pretty good to great. But there's a level of teaching that is below pretty good and is even below just okay. That is not even acknowledged because immediately there's this reflexive, but there are kids involved.
Yeah.
Kids are important. Yeah. Every child deserves a great teacher, you guys. Yeah. We cannot talk about, losing your temper. Yeah. We cannot talk about saying something to a kid that you shouldn't have said.
Right.
We cannot talk about falling so behind on grades that there is not any possible way that you can catch up with a real level of feedback before report card time.
Right.
So that's just this like abyss of information where not only is the information not out there because nobody wants to admit that they were there, but also you can't necessarily reach out to the people who are supposed to help you elevate your teaching from pretty good to excellent for those things, because the thing that would...
But you're not pretty good yet,
right? Right. I mean, the idea that you are in there feeling like you are doing your kids a disservice, like they would be better off with any other adult in front of them.
Well, not any, right?
Not any. I know what you're
saying.
Another adult that is interchangeable with you, and that you feel like you may even be taking up the space that someone who would be better for these kids would be taking up. There's nothing to help you get from there to pretty good. So that's the area that I felt like I needed to fill in, because there's a lot. And listen, there are some teachers who will never be good. They don't care if they're good, or they just don't like kids, or they just aren't into this. But I think that those teachers are not seeking out my type of advice at all. I just, the ideal person, to answer kind of my own question, the person that I picture in my audience is someone who, wherever they are as a teacher, they may not necessarily be a new teacher, but wherever they are as a teacher, they want to be better because they think that their students deserve the best that they can give. And also because they like being good at things and want to elevate their game as much as they can. But they need someone to give them honest, practical advice that starts from where they're at and doesn't automatically, reflectively go into this, like, can we think about what it's like to be a child and how much, these kids are going through a lot at home. And it's like, I know the kids are going through a lot at home, but now they're going through a lot in my classroom because I am not up to this yet, so.
Yeah. So let me ask you this though, because some of the things you described, like just to take an example, being so behind on grading that you can't give good feedback, right? Some of it could be there are things the individual teacher might need to get better at. But some of it could be that their teacher is working in a school/a system that is asking so much of them that there's almost no way they can give the kind of feedback that's good feedback, right? So I guess what I'm getting at is I'm assuming that some of the issues that leaves them in this kind of abyss that you describe is systemic, right? And this is not to take anything away from the teacher in terms of what they can and can't do, but I just want to know if you could speak a little bit to how do you think about that piece of it? Like, what about the conditions, right, that leaves them way below that pretty good stage?
That is a very good question. And that observation is 100% on point. And I can give a few examples of what you're talking about. So I think some of the systemic stuff that matches up with the teacher training stuff is that there are things that no one can admit when it comes to working with students, because again, there are kids involved and the kids deserve the very best, which I mean, who can argue with that statement? Right. Okay, but then what you have is you have certain things where people say we're setting this expectation for teachers because this is what students deserve. But what students deserve is in a way limitless and undefined. I mean, there is no upper level to what every student deserves, really. As far as a teacher caring about them, as far as a teacher, helping them improve, and as far as a teacher both keeping discipline in the class, but also being understanding of individual students. So there are certain areas where no guidance is given, except for something that rounds off to students deserve the very best.
Right.
So nobody really tells you this is how many grades you should have in your grade book each week, and this is the level of feedback that should be involved. Why? Because if they did say that, then that opens it up for teachers to do the math, which I have done the math on grading, which as a high school English teacher, whenever I assigned an essay, I got 150 of those essays back. Damn. And if I spent 5 minutes...
Wait, hold up. 150?
Well, you have, let's say, 5 to 6 classes with approximately 25 to 30 students.
I may not have realized that you taught that many classes.
I would say that's pretty typical. 5 to 6 periods with anywhere from 20 to 30.
Yeah.
And 150 is kind of an easy number to work with. So 150, and I don't remember these exact numbers, but 150 times 5 minutes ends up being something like
you're going to have to do math on my podcast, right?
So please don't make me do the math unless you're going to fully cut it out. But it's something like, it's an amount of hours. Let's just say this.
Yeah.
It's an amount of hours that if you really said a teacher should spend this many hours grading each essay that a high school group of high schoolers turns in, anybody would say that number is ridiculous. So now you're making the teacher secretly make the decision to spend less than 50. Now you're making the teacher rewind. Now you're making the teacher make a secret decision to spend less than 5 minutes per assignment. And one way to do that is to eyeball it and rush through.
Right.
Another way to do that is to come up with certain strategies. And this is one of the things I have an entire course that I work with teachers, working back from that number.
Right.
And realizing that number is unacceptable. I help teachers come up with strategies to do the best possible that they can within the teacher time and effort that's required. Because you don't just give one assignment per week.
Right. Yeah, and we're going to talk about our course in a second, and I'll actually some more detail on it. But it unfortunately a little bit, part of it is trying to figure out how best you can make lemonade, right? Like how best you can do right by these students who deserve the best, right?
Right.
But with the tools that you have.
Right.
And then just for context, you taught in Houston, 4th grade, in a high needs district, if I'm remembering correctly. And then in high school was Hialeah High School in Hialeah, Florida, which is in Greater Miami-Dade County. What was that, 10th grade?
I taught all the different grades of high school, but the majority was 9th and 10th grade.
Okay. So I'll take you back to that where you said, okay, you took several years to kind of get to a point where you're realizing all of the hidden curriculum associated with developing these skills, and then your sister, becomes a teacher as well, and so maybe there's a little bit of advice being bequeathed, right, based on experience. That's what then led to See Me After Class. Yes.
So I was giving my sister this advice, this off-the-record advice that I couldn't get anyone to give to me. And by the way, there are many families of educators. And one of the things that I've found, without any data to back this up, but I've worked with teachers for 2 decades, people whose parents were teachers are so much better equipped when they first start their first teaching job.
Well, it's like first generation college students.
Yes.
Right?
I'm sure.
Versus,
yes.
Yeah, you come in with that capital.
For sure. And I think it's just because you have to have someone close enough to you that they are willing to risk telling you things about those private decisions that they've made that nobody is willing to say to teachers as a group. So I was willing to do that for my sister. And then I just found, my sister had a few roommates. I was talking to some of them about that. And then I just realized I started giving presentations at my own high school to the incoming teachers. And as I widened the circle to start, I started doing new teacher orientation speeches for the whole county eventually. It was basically the same seed of the desire to say, okay, there is a way to talk about this stuff that doesn't let teachers off the hook for what students deserve, because I also think that there is something, I call it like the teaching sucks genre. I try to steer away from that, and I try to steer teachers away from that if they have to go into work the next day. Because yes, you can complain about the job of teaching, and you can be 100% right. There's plenty to complain about. But when we talk about being honest about teaching, I don't necessarily think, when we talk about being honest about teaching, I think a lot of people immediately say, yeah, let's talk about how much teaching sucks. Right. And that's not what teachers need either. You want to feel like you're in a noble profession that's one of the oldest professions of humanity that will always be with us in some form, where you can recognize another teacher from across a room of people you've never met before. It crosses all kinds of, cultural and class lines. For you to meet another teacher, you immediately have things to talk about. It's something that I've always was proud to say I was a teacher. I mean, there's so much to like about teaching when it's going right, and even when it's going just okay, even when it's going badly, but you handled it well.
Right.
There's so much to like about it. So it's not being honest about how much teaching can suck. It's about being honest about what are the trade-offs that we never talk about, and that you need to make a decision. Then you need to be able to admit to someone that you've made the decision.
Right or wrong, right? And I guess that's one of the things that maybe I'm hoping kind of listeners take from here, because I also know, you didn't mention this, but I also know that you also don't like the hyperbole superhero narrative of teaching, like the freedom riders type of thing. And so, that's almost like one extreme.
Yes.
And then the teaching sucks is kind of the other extreme. And it feels like what your argument is, teaching is real life. You show up, you're human, you're trying to make relationships, you're trying to do the best with what the system gives you. And in engaging in that effort, mistakes are going to be made, there are going to be successes, and there's going to be a lot of stuff in between. And the conversation to be had about that everyday experience needs to bring in all of that in its most authentic and truthful self, which to me is a narrative that can apply to all levels of teaching. I actually thought you were going to say, when you were talking about giving advice to your sister and friends, and you woke up one day and like, wait a second, I should charge you. What the hell, man? It's like Friday evening, you all have me.
Right?
Take a 6-pack of Stella. All right. So, but the book you wrote, the first book you wrote, See Me After Class, and the subtitle is Advice for Teachers by Teachers, available Amazon, anywhere you get your books. So the Advice for Teachers by Teachers part, it's because you interviewed a lot of actual teachers.
Yes.
So talk to us about that, and what sort of gave the book its special flavor because of that process.
Sure. I interviewed over 100 teachers. Pretty much all anonymously. They had the choice whether they wanted to be listed in the acknowledgments, but for the most part, I tried to keep it very vague and change identifying details because I wanted people to be as honest with me as they possibly could. And then I found that after I interviewed 100 or so people, then I felt like it was my job as the author. It became my job as the author to pick out the themes that I was hearing that were what I think teachers need to know that aren't being told. So there's just different chapters on probably what you would think. Grading work without hating work is the one that addresses what we talked about, but there's the classroom management chapter, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just what I think no one says, and then what I think should be said, and then stories from other teachers to give a little context.
Yeah. So is the arc of that book is the arc of that book what informed the course that you just talked about?
So does it inform the course? I would say my career in education has been very weird. I always have trouble writing a bio for myself. Because the common thread of what I've always tried to do, I've written See Me After Class, and I wrote a novel that I describe as The Office, but set in an urban high school, which was trying to capture the way that teachers' personal lives and professional lives interact, and then sometimes how politics trickles down to that. And now I have courses for teachers that are meant for teachers to be able to afford to take them themselves, kind of bite-sized mini courses that are backed up by my support. That, by the way, people can find out more about at my website, which is roxannaelden.com. And I have some free resources that they can also download.
We'll be adding this to the resource page.
But I would say that almost seems like it connects more to See Me After Class, my first book, plus all of the workshops and speaking gigs and one-on-one coaching that I did as a result of that. But the through line of my bio, and I know this because I've revised it many times, is I try to cut through the cliches that people usually use when they talk about teaching. And I try to get to something that is honest, practical, nuanced, and sometimes funny. And that is the one thing that I can say applies to every single thing that I've done since I've started talking about teaching.
How many episodes are in the course? I shouldn't call it episodes. Maybe I'm podcast mind. But how many modules are in the course?
There are about 6, depending on how you slice it. And I experiment with different ways of delivering those because I know that some people prefer to have all access plus some personalized coaching calls. And then some people would rather just pay for the one thing they need and only check in if they need to.
Yeah.
So it's about 6. I may add some, and then there's bundles and ways to combine them. Sure.
All right, let's talk adequate yearly progress, which I'll confess is my favorite of the two. Not that I didn't like the first one, just that genre-wise, right? That's this sort of like based on real life, but turned into a story, and maybe to an extent, I think it gives you an opportunity to sort of draw themes out in ways that are a little bit more difficult when you're just trying to do something biographical. And that book had, like you said, right? You it's a mix of the personal and the professional, and you try to kind of humanize the characters and understand and get the reader to understand how choices made in their personal life was brought to bear and how they approach the classroom to a certain extent. Maybe I can start with what led you to want to take that kind of project on, especially after writing an advice book. What made that the approach you wanted to try out? All
right, so I'm gonna tell a little bit of a personal story that answers your question. So, See Me After Class came out in 2009, and it was about a 5-year process to get that book out because I didn't know how to write a book or get it published or anything. And it came out pretty much on the last day of school. It was this amazing moment. My students showed up. My vice principal showed up and said my discipline was good, and I never sent anyone to the office, which made me tear up. and it was just like everything, it's like the end of the movie.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there's no real end of the movie in real life. So then I spent that summer not having a book to write. Supposedly promoting that book, but that really amounted to me writing guest blogs and then hitting refresh over and over and over to see if anyone had commented on the guest blogs. And I had this hole in my life, and it was this real letdown that I've since heard other authors say there's kind of like a postpartum depression that sets in after the book comes out. And the feeling of accomplishment of writing a book just evaporated. And what I realized is
almost immediately.
No. I mean, it was great, and I'm still proud of it. But it's not a feeling you wake up every day and you go like, "Hey, how about that book I wrote?"
Yeah.
Right. So I didn't think too much of it at the time. Went through that summer, and then the following school year, I always bribe my students, or I always used to bribe my students to participate in this thing called National Novel Writing Month, which is every November, beginning at midnight on November 1st, ending midnight on December 1st. you have to come up with a 50,000 word rough draft of a novel. And the only way you can accomplish that is by speeding through it, never looking back at what you wrote, not worrying about whether you wrote as good. Sometimes probably just sitting there typing like, not sure what to say next, so I'll say this. But at the end of it, you have a draft of a novel. So for a few years by then, I had bribed my students with extra credit and pizza parties to participate in that. And it was always optional. But I always had about 10 students who did it and who actually completed it. And that particular year, in November of 2009, one of my students said, like, how about you, Miss Elden? You've never done National Novel Writing Month. And all of a sudden I said, okay, I'm going to do it. And I knew exactly what I wanted in a novel that I had never seen, which was a multi-character split point of view novel that followed several teachers. I was a fan of Tom Wolfe, I was a fan of Zadie Smith, and I was a fan of Jennifer Egan. Those are some of my favorite authors that do that. And I said, this needs to be a novel about teachers. And then shows like The Office and Parks and Rec, like I like that tone where it's they address real issues.
You just like Lil Sebastian. That's all.
I do like Lil Sebastian. I like shows that deal with workplace issues and deal with personal issues, serious issues, make you think about them, but in a humorous way that you can take, but they really mix the two. So I just set out to write that type of novel, and I thought I would be done in a couple of years, and it ended up taking me 8 years to finish that novel. But once I started, I could not let go of it. And then I realized that what I really enjoyed is working on a project, figuring out my way through challenges of a project.
Which of the characters, okay, we're going to ask you a couple questions. Which of the characters were the hardest to write?
Ooh, that's a good question. I thought you were going to ask me which one is me, and I had my answer prepared for that. But which of the characters was the hardest
you see that first that question I thought I was going to ask. That's the easy stuff. I feel like everybody who gets a chance to talk to an author assumes that they wrote themselves in, and I think maybe through my own reading and going to book talks and stuff, you realize like don't assume that that's the case. So even if it is, don't assume they'll be honest and tell you, right? But so my question is just about, you wrote the characters, which one was the hardest to write?
Which one was the hardest to write? A lot of my characters were based on collections of observations that I made about teaching.
And in so doing, can you maybe explain a little bit to the audience what the book's about? I mean,
sure.
You can kind of intuit, but maybe just to help them. Yeah.
It is a multiple point of view novel that follows about 5 major high school teacher characters at the same urban high school in a city in Texas that is not Houston by name, but is a lot like Houston. And the teachers are very different demographically. They each teach a different subject, which informs the way they look at things and the way they look at life. I mean, a scientist is going to think scientifically. A math person is going to be very mathematical and organized, you might think. And and they would each have different knowledge bases that they would filter things through. But they also each got into teaching different ways, and have very different teaching styles. And they also span different cultures and genders and ages. So I think that each of them, if they're based on anything, they're based on a collection of observations about teaching in the education world. And then I kind of assign those to the person who would be the best filter to express those things to the audience. And the personalities of the teachers, maybe just because it took so long to write this thing, became so clear. I would just be out and I would just see someone. I go, you know what? This person has something in common with this character. And I would just make a note of it. And I'm constantly sending myself emails with ideas for the book. That's how I collect the ideas. So that all came pretty naturally. But then, that being said, there were aspects of these characters' lives that I did need to research because I didn't have the knowledge base and experiences these characters had. So in particular, one of the characters is a football coach. I'm not much of a sports person in general, let alone a football fan. But I didn't want this person to be a caricature.
You did.
I did not. I didn't want any of my characters to be caricatures.
Oh, caricatures. Sorry,
Caricatures.
I heard characters.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I wanted to feel like his observations were coming from him, not me,
Yeah.
through someone I'm calling a football coach.
Right.
So I definitely hung out with a football coach that I was friendly with at my school, who was extremely generous in making me not sound idiotic. And then I had another friend who was a sports writer who used to cover high school sports. He also gave it a pass. And then I had to read some books about football.
Yeah.
I had to find my way into what interested me about football. And I was able to do that. I mean, I still am not someone who would sit down and watch a football game for fun. But there have been books about football that I really was able to get into that were about, the youth football culture, football coaching. And I cannot say if I did a good job, because at this point, I actually don't read reviews of my work because I don't think I can handle it. I could quote any review that is negative word for word, and I need to stay away from those. But you'd have to ask someone else how I did. And the same goes for any other, for any other character. But I think that's something I can point to where is like, this was a complete gap in my knowledge that I had to fill in.
So which was your favorite to write?
My favorite character to write. Weirdly, because there is an English teacher and I taught English. There is someone who demographically matches me, although personality-wise, not so much. But the person that I really enjoyed exploring her character was a character called Maybelline, who's a math teacher and who was really based on people who I personally almost never click with.
Right.
These are never people that I hate. But they are people where I'm just like, it's not my type of person, and I can tell I'm not their type of person.
Right.
And in creating this character, it just forced me to go, okay, what would these people think from their point of view? And I was able to really, I think, become more compassionate toward that personality type. And I just enjoyed writing this character so much because, again, it's not somebody I hate. It's almost like a personality type I can't figure out.
Right.
But it's for real. Like the people who share her personality traits, that's the most natural to them.
Right.
So I think that was the storyline I enjoyed the most.
So my favorite character, and I'm blanking on names because it's been a while since I've read it, but there was a teacher from Philly. And she was in, I don't want to spoil the ending for people, but she was in love with a poet, and so you sort of followed her for a while, and it's kind of some decisions that she made. And it maybe I like that character because of one of the things that I'm sensitive to, or maybe very interested in terms of humanization of education is that people are complex, situations are complex, identity is complex, right? And very often, you didn't say this explicitly, but I think you've implied it several times in this conversation. Very often, the achievement conversation, the equity in education conversation gets boiled down to simple matters of black and white and poor and rich and low income, not low income. And, those variables exist. But, somebody who presents as a person of color, that presentation doesn't necessarily speak to the complexity and the non-linearity of their experience, right? And what they're navigating with respect to that. And I'm partly saying this as somebody who is of color and who's an immigrant, right? And grew up in a culture where, that was still my identity, but how that unfolded in Trinidad is different to how it unfolded in my 25 years in the US. And this is not what that character wasn't international, but I think there was some of that in her past. So I loved how that came out. And I imagine that it took a little bit of work to explore that and to figure out how to tell that story. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, so I love the observations that you're making. I mean, I just love hearing you as a reader say that, because it's perfect. It's a perfect, I'm so glad that someone read it and took that away, because that was one of the things that I think needs to be explored if you're going to get a panoramic view of education, which is, okay, how do I put this without diving into cliches? I'm going to have another sip of my
go
coffee.
for it. Yeah.
So this is the character that you are describing. Her name is Lena Wright. She's the English teacher character. And I think English in particular, I think, is a teaching subject that attracts people who want to discuss things with students and kind of open students' minds. And it also, I feel like I'm going down a road that doesn't make sense.
Go down.
Wes. There's a lot of personality in deciding how and what to teach English. As much as you might try to give guidelines to teachers, your personality is going to come through quite a bit, and your viewpoint is going to come through quite a bit, whether you want it to or not, as an English teacher. So this is a teacher who comes from a very educated background. She's African American, so she looks like quite a few of her students in this school. However, this school is predominantly not students whose parents are professors, and she is the child of something along those lines, or potentially is a child of professors. So she wants to teach her students the way that she thinks that her, based on what she thinks she can bring to the table. But also, she was a way of exploring what teachers want out of being a teacher. And one of my theories going into the book, and also my theory in general, is we all want something out of being a teacher. And what she wanted out of being a teacher was to be part of a community, and specifically what she saw as her community. So, yes, she grew up from a very educated and you could say privileged background. At the same time, she grew up as an only child, as in a very small family, no pets, not a lot of connection to what she would consider the wider culture. And so here she is in the South, hoping to reconnect with something that she's hoping to connect with. And that part is not going as well as she would have hoped. And especially because there are some flashbacks to her first year. She's not someone who, is struggling in the typical, new teacher movie way of classroom management. And she's a pretty dynamic and charismatic person. So she's not necessarily having trouble getting through to students, but at the same time, she's not coming off the way that she hoped to. And that's part of what she needs to learn and figure out what she's going to do about it.
But that's okay. So I get that. But the honestly, the most powerful thing I took away from your description is you have somebody, and again, this is me betraying some personal experiences here. You have somebody who presents a certain way physically, and you find yourself in community with other people who present that way as well. But you are starkly reminded that in reality, and for many variables, you are kind of in the out group, right? And so how do you? There's no law saying that you have to be in the in group, but you still feel it, right? So even though you say, and I'll just be straight up. Like when I got to Morehouse College, when I, historically black college, 99% black all male identifying students, right? My accent stuck out. My, music choices and stuff like that stuck out. But there was this part of you feeling like, oh, well, I'm supposed to like this music. I'm supposed to know more about these artists and things like that. And I know you didn't go into that much detail with his character, but just this message about assumption of monolithicity. Is that a word? Monolithicness.
It is now.
It
and
is
it
now,
makes
right?
sense,
Yeah, but you get what I'm saying, right? And knowing intellectually that that's not rational, but also still feeling psychologically like, am I supposed to? And it felt like that's what she was navigating.
Yes. Good observation. And I think part of what you're pointing to is just like teachers have this abyss area of things they're never able to talk about because they are not supposed to exist. I think those exist in a lot of areas of our lives. And one of them I do believe can be connecting to your culture,
Right.
or your culture in quotations.
Right.
Like what is your culture? Wanting to be part of a community can be a very weird thing to admit. And then it also is hard to figure out.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't know if that's exactly, I guess I'm just kind of seconding your point in a different way. But I think it's okay to want to be part of a community. I think that can be a goal in your life that you're working toward. But it's just such a goofy thing to admit.
Right.
And then you can't ask the question how if you can't admit that that's what you'd like to do.
Yeah.
And that's something that I do explore through her, and also on behalf of teachers in general, because this is certainly not limited to her culture. I mean, I did see what I would perceive as this dilemma with many teachers teaching what would be supposedly their own culture if you took a picture of the class with the teacher in front of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there are so many variations. And if you hope to be an insider and you've been an outsider in various ways your whole life, which is her case, and then you find that you're an outsider in a completely different and unexpected way, even though on paper you may look like your students, that's, for that particular character, that's something very difficult.
Yeah.
But in general, that's something that I think people struggle with. And I do feel like I'm in a totally different topic.
No. Well, no, you're not. And again, sensitive to it partly. This is something I've been thinking about. In fact, I've been exploring with a colleague, Dr. E.C. Satse Vega. We've been exploring a whole different way of thinking about belonging, because sometimes, and this is back to Lena, there's sometimes the assumptions are binary. It's like, to belong is good, to not belong is bad. And maybe without any kind of nuance that for a lot of people, your life is such that you're never really in a place where the belonging is just automatic. Is that your professional and personal life shapes and shifts, and between marriage, partners, friends, and stuff. What you're actually doing is you're always in a state of adaptation, and it's not necessarily always a bad thing, right? There are things to be learned from that. So I guess what I took from Lena was not so much, okay, is there a point where she could belong finally, but more of how is Lena just handling these several new circumstances that's forcing her to relook at her own identity. Right. And I don't think that question has to have one answer.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. I like what you're saying about adaptation. And I think this is reminding me that what I had hoped to say about teaching. I think one of the dilemmas that people face in teaching, and more for some people than others, is what does it mean to be part of a community as a teacher? Because certainly a trap to avoid, and this is me talking as someone who gives advice to teachers, being one of the kids is not the target to aim for. Right. And that's not, she knows that.
Yeah.
But what does it mean to be embraced by a community when you are by nature, they're all sitting in seats, you're at the front of the class. They're the same age, you're a different age.
Right.
You're there to bring something they don't have. So you're not really going to be exactly part of the community in the way that a new kid moving to the high school and joining the student body would be. So what does it mean to become part of a community, but in the capacity of teachers? Because you're also probably not going to be best buddies with your students' parents who are closer to your age. So that was one of the things I explored through that character. And for a teacher that's important to, I think many of us, and I count myself in that group. I moved to a new city as a teacher, and I certainly didn't want to be completely alone, feel completely alone and isolated when I was there. For teachers teaching in there, a lot of teachers are teaching in the cities where they grew up, but often not the neighborhood where they grew up.
Right.
And then some teachers are teaching in the high school they went to high school.
Right.
And so that's a whole different dilemma. And I think that is also addressed in the book in different ways.
So I'll get you out of here on this last point, which you actually kind of just brought up and made me think about English teaching in a different way. And I think your exact phrase was, people who teach English, one of the reasons why they do it is because they are attracted to dialogue. They are attracted to, there's something new. And I've heard that said in a different way at the college level in terms of, there's typically only one way osmosis works, right? So like every year, I know I brought up a science topic, but, a lot of science concepts, like, I'm a big advocate of dialogue in the science classroom. People who know my work know that. But there's certainly a lot of proofs that we are no longer disputing thermodynamics, etc. So to some extent, those kinds of discussions are leading to the same conclusion, whether it's intro bio in 2020, 2021, whatever, right? But what it sounds like is you can teach Huckleberry Finn or whatever, and next year's class will take something a whole different tack from it than last year's class and the classes after that. And that's part of the beauty of it. But also with that, 1B is this class only makes sense if we are in conversation, right? That's the whole point of this, right? This is not me coming to tell you. And I guess right now I feel like that process and that way of thinking about education has a lot to teach the world and particularly our society right now. The value of dialogue, the value of listening, the value of hearing different points of view, the value of bringing life experience to an opinion, to a classic text. I wonder if that's just something you've thought about, whether it was when you were actually teaching or even when you consult with teachers now, this sort of special place that classroom has to teach that particular skill, especially in the communities that you've worked in.
That is it's a good question. Also such a big question.
I know. That's why we end with it.
So I want to be careful because all subjects do this to a certain extent.
I agree with you 100%.
But especially with English, you are teaching always a combination of material and you're teaching some type of thinking skill along with that material. But there's not in math, you have the exact match.
Right.
You're teaching the division problems, but then you're also teaching how to solve division problems and how to understand division. When you teach Romeo and Juliet, and that, by the way, I taught that 36 times.
Not that you're counting or anything.
Until I begged my principal to give me a different class because I just could not with that anymore. But it's a good story. So strongly recommend. 5 stars.
Summer's Night Dream.
But still, when you're teaching Romeo and Juliet, what thinking skill is supposed to go along with that? Is it understanding language that's from hundreds of years ago? Is it looking at things from different points of view of characters that all have a distinct and right point of view? Is it just knowing one of the classics that people will refer to your whole life? Is it appreciating drama? Or is there some other, do we want to have a debate about this? And if so, what do we want to debate?
Right.
And anything you read can be approached in so many different ways. And some of it is going to come from, what do you think these students need from this experience?
Right.
So there's just more ways of combining thinking skills, communication skills, critical thinking, which is very hard to teach on its own, but I do think is tremendously a responsibility of an English teacher and it's always a puzzle to figure out. And how to where do you start and what's your goal even, right?
Right.
Because at the end of the year, students are going to take a certain kind of test. In math, I believe that those tests more or less test what the kids know.
Yeah.
And in higher level English, they will never capture what you fully what you've hoped to give to students.
Could you tell us a bit more about where people can find your course?
Sure. My website is roxannaelden.com, and it is hopefully set up so that you can find everything that you need
It's
about
set
me.
up like that. Including the YouTube channel, right?
I also have a YouTube channel that is pretty new, and you're welcome to watch those videos. But most of those videos will also direct you back to the website where you can download a free classroom management guide, and that will also put you on my occasional mailing list where I'll share thoughts about teaching. Right. Everything is geared toward making your teacher life more manageable.
Okay. Roxanna Elden Volmar, author of See Me After Class, Advice for Teachers by Teachers, and Adequate Yearly Progress. Thank you so much for joining us.
Can I say thank you for having me now?
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. This was a fantastic conversation.
You act like I prevented you from doing it earlier.
You literally prevented me from doing that at the beginning of this podcast.
Hey, thanks so much, man.
Thank you.
Look, back and I'm better than ever. I think I got a vendetta. Oh, now they call me, I seen it.
Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. We are generously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Thank you once again to my guest today, Roxanna Elden Volmar. You can catch her book, See Me After Class, and Adequate Yearly Progress, wherever you buy your books. As always, the producer, Mr. Segev Amasai, class of 2025. Segev, how was that episode?
It's very insightful.
In what way? Well,
No,
before you answer, the reason why I ask is because this is our first episode that kind of looks at secondary education directly, right? So the author is Roxanna is talking about teachers. And I guess just for you, since you're closer to secondary education than I was, I just wondered how some of the things that you brought up, how it sat with you.
Well, the one thing that just really stuck out to me was just how long she's been doing this for. A good 15 years, because her book was released in 2009.
Yeah.
So, definitely take you can definitely take the word of someone that's been doing this for quite a long time and just kind of see how her work evolves, with
Over time.
over time.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's, and I guess this is, my parting message, the way I would put it, I guess when I read her books, especially Adequate Yearly Progress, and See Me After Class to a certain extent, but everything has a hidden curriculum. We talk about hidden curriculum a lot when it comes to students and the things that they aren't told or need to find out to be successful in higher ed. But even when we practice our craft at whatever level we do that practice at, there are things they don't say out loud, and maybe to the extent that her work says the quiet part out loud, that was really enjoyable. So I hope that's what you take from our conversation this week. This is a bonus episode. We just wanted to do something special for all of the teachers, professors included, who are going back to the classroom. We want to wish you just the very, very best academic year going forward, and hope that your students bring you pride and joy and love and community, and that you do as you always do, which is put your best foot forward in the classroom. As always, please be excellent to each other.
Just like teachers have this abyss area of things they're never able to talk about because they are not supposed to exist, I think those exist in a lot of areas of our lives. And one of them, I do believe, can be connecting to your culture,
Right.
or your culture in quotations.
Right.
Like what is your culture?
I swear I shoot like Berettas.
I think one of the dilemmas that people face in teaching, and more for some people than others, is what does it mean to be part of a community as a teacher?
Right.
You're there to bring something they don't have. So you're not really going to be exactly part of the community in the way that a new kid moving to the high school and joining the student body would be. So what does it mean to become part of a community, but in the capacity?
Oh, now they call me, I seen them. All of those times getting severed. I told them all I get let up. They get not tired of me never. Give me a shot and I swear I shoot like Berettas. That's how I shoot. Lately I'm driven like I'm on the road.